The morning of March 21, 1944, a British motor torpedo boat cut its engines 200 yards from the Brittany coast. In the pre-dawn darkness, a single passenger prepared to disembark. Virginia Hall adjusted the leather straps binding her prosthetic leg to her waist, checked the waterproof pouch containing her forged identification papers, and lowered herself into the freezing Atlantic waters. The wooden leg, she called Cuthbert, weighed 8 pounds. It chafed her skin raw. It made every step a calculated risk, and the Gestapo had plastered her face across wanted posters throughout occupied France with orders that were brutally simple: find the limping lady, destroy her. Most intelligence officers would have considered this mission suicide. Virginia Hall was returning to a country where she was already the most wanted Allied spy. Her face was known. Her limp was unmistakable. Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, had personally declared that he would give anything to capture the woman his agents called Dame Qui Boite. But Hall wasn't returning to France despite her prosthetic leg. She was returning because the Gestapo and Wehrmacht officers had made one catastrophic assumption. They believed a disabled woman could never be the architect of their mounting losses. They believed physical limitation meant operational weakness. They believed wrong. Within 6 months, the resistance networks Hall would organize from farmhouse attics and barn lofts would derail 8 German supply trains, destroy 4 bridges, sever 16 railway lines, and kill or capture over 600 enemy soldiers. All while the woman coordinating these operations posed as a 60-year-old milkmaid who could barely walk. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how Virginia Hall became the most dangerous Allied spy in occupied Europe begins not with courage, but with rejection. Born April 6, 1906, in Baltimore, Maryland, Hall grew up in a world that promised intelligent women almost nothing. Her wealthy family could afford the best education: Radcliffe College, Barnard College, graduate studies in Paris, Vienna, and Strasbourg. She spoke French, German, and Italian fluently. She wanted to serve her country as a diplomat. The United States State Department had other plans. In 1929, they hired her as a consular clerk in Warsaw. Not a diplomat, a clerk, a typist with a college degree. She accepted because it was the only door open. She transferred to Smyrna, Turkey in 1933, still filing papers, still answering phones, still waiting for someone to recognize that her language skills and education qualified her for more than secretarial work. On a hunting trip in December 1933, 27-year-old Virginia Hall climbed a wire fence while carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. Her foot slipped, the weapon discharged, the blast tore through her left foot. Turkish doctors tried to save the limb. Gangrene set in. Her leg was amputated below the knee. Wikipedia. She was fitted with a crude prosthetic, 8 pounds of wood, aluminum, and leather strapped to her body. It would cause pressure sores and blisters every single day for the rest of her life. When Hall returned to the Venice consulate and applied for a diplomatic position, the State Department invoked an obscure regulation: amputees could not serve as diplomats. Wikipedia. Her appeal to President Franklin Roosevelt went unanswered. In 1939, Virginia Hall resigned from the State Department. She was 33 years old. She had a prosthetic leg that made her conspicuous, and she had just watched Europe descend into war. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hall was living in Paris. When France mobilized, she volunteered for the French ambulance service, not because she believed France would win, because sitting safely in America while Europe burned was intolerable. She drove ambulances through the chaos of the Fournois War. She saw French military incompetence firsthand. She watched German panzers punch through the Ardennes with a speed that made pre-war defensive plans look like fantasy. And when Paris fell in June 1940, Hall did what thousands of others could not. She escaped. The journey south through collapsing French lines took weeks. Refugees clogged every road. German Stukas strafed columns of civilians. Hall made it to Spain, then to Portugal, and finally to London in early 1941. She had no job, no prospects, and absolutely no intention of spending the war filing paperwork. The Special Operations Executive was Winston Churchill's answer to Hitler's occupation of Europe. Set Europe ablaze, the Prime Minister had ordered. SOE would train agents in weapons, explosives, sabotage, and survival. Then drop them behind enemy lines to organize resistance, gather intelligence, and make the occupation as costly as possible. SOE was desperate for operatives who spoke fluent French and knew the country intimately. Virginia Hall spoke perfect French with a slight American accent. She knew France better than most natives, and she had one quality that made her uniquely valuable. Nobody would suspect that a limping American woman was Britain's newest spy. The training was brutal. Hall learned to kill with her bare hands. She learned to pick locks, to forge documents, to operate a wireless radio. Under combat conditions, she learned which explosives could derail a train, which could collapse a bridge, which could turn a German ammunition dump into a crater visible from space. Her instructors had doubts. The wooden leg made her conspicuous in ways that could prove fatal. Movement at night, climbing stairs, running from pursuit. Every action that able-bodied agents took for granted became exponentially more difficult. With Cuthbert strapped to her body, Hall had a simple response: send me anyway. In August 1941, Virginia Hall arrived in Vichy, France, posing as a correspondent for the New York Post. She created the Heckler Network in Lyon Wikipedia. Her cover was brilliant in its simplicity. American journalists were still nominally neutral. She could travel freely, ask questions, meet with sources, and file stories that contained coded messages to SOE headquarters in London. Lyon was the heart of the French resistance. It was also crawling with Gestapo agents hunting Allied spies. Hall rented a small apartment on a quiet street. She established dead drops where agents could leave messages. She identified safe houses where downed British pilots could hide. She recruited French citizens who hated the occupation and wanted to fight back. The work was methodical, patient, and absolutely lethal, if discovered. Every meeting risked betrayal. Every radio transmission risked detection by German direction-finding equipment. Every agent she recruited could be a Gestapo plant waiting to destroy the entire network. For 15 months, Hall organized resistance movements, supplied agents with money and weapons, helped downed airmen escape, and offered safe houses and medical assistance. Wikipedia. She became expert at reading people, at spotting surveillance, at changing her routine so that no pattern emerged, at moving through Lyon with that distinctive limp, while Gestapo agents searched for the mysterious woman their informants mentioned in whispers. The German intelligence network was sophisticated. They intercepted messages, they turned resistance members through torture, they offered immunity to collaborators who provided information, and they were getting closer. Klaus Barbie arrived in Lyon in November 1942 as the new Gestapo chief. He was 31 years old. He had served in the SS since 1936. His methods of interrogation were so savage that even other SS officers complained. He personally supervised torture sessions. He specialized in breaking resistance networks by identifying and eliminating their leadership. Barbie received reports about an American woman who limped, who seemed to know everyone, who appeared at safe houses just before Allied pilots escaped, who was present when weapons appeared in resistance hands. The reports described her physical appearance: red blonde hair, pronounced limp, American accent she tried to conceal. In November 1942, the Gestapo closed in. One of Hall's contacts was arrested and tortured. Under duress, he provided information about safe house locations and communication methods. Hall received warning from a resistance member who worked as a cleaner in Gestapo headquarters. She had, perhaps, 24 hours before armed men kicked down her door. Running was impossible. The Germans controlled every exit from France. Rail stations, ports, airports, all monitored. Attempting to flee through normal channels meant certain capture. Hall had one option: the mountains. The Pyrenees rise like a wall between France and Spain. In November, the high passes are already buried in snow. Temperatures drop below freezing at night. The trails are steep, treacherous, and guarded by German patrols on the French side and Spanish border guards on the southern slopes. Hall hired a smuggler who knew a crossing point the Germans hadn't discovered. She packed light, forged papers, some money, the clothes on her back, and Cuthbert, that 8-pound wooden limb that would make every step of the next 50 miles an exercise in controlled agony. The crossing took 3 days. Hall climbed 7,500 feet into mountain passes where the air was thin and cold enough to freeze exposed skin. The leather straps holding her prosthetic leg cut into her waist and thigh. The wooden foot caught on rocks, on steep descents. The rigid ankle joint made each step a potential fall. At one point, Hall radioed London with a message that would become legend. She said she was worried Cuthbert would cause problems. SOE headquarters, not understanding the reference, replied, "If Cuthbert troublesome, eliminate him." Wikipedia. When Hall finally stumbled across the Spanish border, she was arrested immediately. Spain was officially neutral, but sympathetic to the Axis. British agents operating in Spanish territory risked imprisonment, or worse. Hall spent 6 weeks in a Spanish jail before American diplomats secured her release. She returned to London in January 1943. She was quietly made an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire. Wikipedia. SOE leadership debriefed her extensively, then told her she was too compromised to return to France. The Gestapo knew her face. Barbie had distributed wanted posters. Sending her back would be suicide. Virginia Hall had not climbed the Pyrenees with a wooden leg to sit out the rest of the war in London. She applied to the American Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was newer, less bureaucratic, and desperate for experienced operatives. They hired her immediately. Hall underwent additional training, advanced wireless operation, new codes, updated sabotage techniques, and she developed something that would prove crucial to her survival. A disguise so complete that even people who had known her in Lyon would not recognize the elegant American journalist. She dyed her hair grey. She had a London dentist grind down her teeth to resemble a French milkmaid, a mighty girl. She practiced walking with a shuffling gait that disguised her limp. She wore peasant clothing, rough fabrics, practical shoes. She transformed herself into a 60-year-old French farm woman who had lived her entire life in rural poverty. On March 21st, 1944, that British torpedo boat deposited her on the Brittany coast. Her artificial leg prevented her from parachuting. Wikipedia. So she waded ashore in darkness, carrying forged papers identifying her as Marcel Montagne, a widow who made cheese. The Germans controlled every inch of France. Over 1 million Wehrmacht and SS troops occupied the country. The Gestapo had perfected counterinsurgency techniques. Resistance networks that had flourished in 1941 and 42 had been decimated through systematic arrests and executions. But something had changed. The Germans were losing. In the east, the Red Army was grinding through Ukraine toward Poland. In Italy, Allied forces had landed at Anzio. And across the English Channel, everyone knew an invasion was coming. The resistance needed coordination, weapons, training, leadership that could transform scattered partisan groups into an effective guerrilla force capable of disrupting German reinforcements when the invasion came. Virginia Hall was about to provide exactly that. The barn near Le Chambon-sur-Lignon smelled of hay and old wood when Virginia Hall established her headquarters on July 14, 1944. The Salvation Army owned the building, but hadn't used it in years. Perfect. Isolated enough for security, large enough for supplies, close enough to the Maquis groups scattered across the Haute-Loire countryside. Hall opened her suitcase and revealed what made her so dangerous to the German occupation: a wireless radio. Compact, sophisticated, powerful enough to reach London when properly deployed. But also a death sentence if the Gestapo direction-finding equipment located her signal. Between July 14th and August 14th, she transmitted 37 intelligence messages on enemy troop movements, National Wojsk Museum. Each broadcast required speed and precision. Set up the antenna, power the transmitter, send the coded message, pack everything before German radio detection teams could triangulate her position. The barn, an attic, a farmhouse cellar. She never transmitted from the same location twice. The intelligence she gathered proved critical. She was the first agent to report that the German General Staff was moving its headquarters from Lyons to the city of Le Puy, in the Haute-Loire region National Wojsk Museum. This single piece of information allowed Allied planners to adjust their targeting for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France scheduled for August 15th. But intelligence gathering was only part of Hall's mission. The real work was organizing the Maquis into an effective fighting force. The French resistance fighters, who called themselves maquisards, were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, clerks, mechanics, men who had fled into the countryside to avoid deportation to Germany for forced labor. They lived in camps hidden in the forests and mountains. They had courage. They had motivation. What they lacked was training, weapons, and coordination. Hall's orders were clear. Arm them, train them, prepare them to support the Allied invasion by making German reinforcement and retreat as difficult as possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first challenge was establishing authority. As a woman with the rank of second lieutenant, she had problems asserting her authority over the Maquis groups and the self-proclaimed colonels heading them, a mighty girl. These men had been fighting Germans for months or years. They commanded groups of fighters who followed them personally, and now an American woman with a wooden leg was telling them to take orders from her. Hall sent an urgent message to OSS headquarters. You send people out ostensibly to work with me and for me, but you do not give me the necessary authority. A mighty girl, she complained. The bureaucratic response was predictable. Coordinate with local leadership, build relationships, work within existing command structures. Hull had a better solution: money and weapons. She told the Maquis leaders that she would finance them and give them arms on condition that they would be advised by her. But the prickly Maquis leaders continued to be a problem, a mighty girl. The breakthrough came when 3 plane loads of supplies she received in late July and the money she distributed for expenses gained their grudging acquiescence, a mighty girl. The supply drops came at night. Hall would identify suitable fields, far from German patrols, but accessible enough for the Maquis to reach quickly. She would transmit coordinates to London, then wait for the BBC broadcast that confirmed the operation. Personal messages. That was what the resistance called them. The BBC's French service would broadcast seemingly random phrases after the evening news. The cat drinks milk. Grandmother wears purple shoes. The roses bloom in winter. Each phrase meant something specific to someone somewhere in France. For Hall and her teams, the phrases meant weapons, money, and explosives were coming. The night drops were exercises in controlled chaos, aircraft approaching low over the mountains, metal containers tumbling from cargo bays, parachutes snapping open, the Maquis racing to collect the containers before dawn, while Hall coordinated from a concealed position with her radio ready to abort if German patrols appeared. The containers held everything the resistance needed: British Sten guns, American M1941 carbines, plastic explosives, detonators, medical supplies, French francs and gold coins for paying informants and purchasing supplies from civilians. With weapons in their hands and money for operations, the Maquis transformed from scattered partisan groups into organized combat battalions. The 3 battalions of Maquisards, about 1,500 men, in her area undertook a number of successful sabotage operations, a mighty goal. Hall personally coordinated the targets, railway lines that carried German reinforcements north toward Normandy, where Allied forces were grinding through the hedgerows, bridges that German convoys needed to retreat southward as the invasion expanded, telephone lines that connected Wehrmacht command posts to their forward units. Lieutenant Raoul Le Boulicard, codenamed Bob, commanded 30 Maquis fighters who became Hall's most trusted operatives. They were the teams she deployed for the most dangerous missions, the operations that required precision timing and nerves steady enough to place explosives under active German guard. The railway sabotage followed patterns Hall had learned during OSS training. Small charges placed at rail joints, timed to detonate after the saboteurs had withdrawn to safe positions, effective enough to derail trains without requiring suicidal direct assaults on moving targets. She reported to headquarters that 4 bridges had been blown up, freight trains derailed, a key rail line cut in several places, and telephone lines torn down. CIA. Each success disrupted German logistics. Each delay meant fewer reinforcements reaching the front. Each destroyed bridge meant Wehrmacht units spent hours or days finding alternate routes. But the sabotage campaign carried costs measured in French lives. The Germans responded to resistance activity with brutal efficiency. Towns near sabotage sites faced collective punishment. Hostages selected from local populations, executions conducted publicly to terrorize communities into withdrawing support from the Maquis. Hall witnessed the consequences of her operational decisions. Farmhouses burned because their owners had hidden resistance fighters, civilians shot because they lived near destroyed rail lines, children orphaned because their parents had passed information to the Maquis. The moral calculation was clear, but never easy. Every act of sabotage saved Allied lives and accelerated liberation. Every act of sabotage also invited German reprisals against French civilians who had no choice about becoming targets. Hall made the calculation the same way every resistance leader across occupied Europe made it. The war had to be won. Liberation required sacrifice. The only unacceptable option was inaction. By early August 1944, the tactical situation across France was shifting rapidly. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. American armor was racing toward Paris. German units were beginning the long retreat that would end at the Rhine. In the Haute-Loire, Hall's Maquis battalions were no longer conducting harassment operations. Now, part of the French forces of the interior, they forced the German occupiers to withdraw from Le Puy-en-Velay and head north with the rest of the retreating German forces, a mighty goal. The transformation from guerrilla resistance to conventional military force happened faster than anyone expected. Maquis fighters who had hidden in forest camps were now coordinating with French army units advancing from the south. The liberation was accelerating. On August 25, 1944, a Jedburgh team finally parachuted into the Haute-Loire to assist with training and supply operations. The 3-man team, called Jeremy, consisted of British, American, and French officers sent to coordinate between Allied command and resistance forces. Hall's reaction to their arrival was documented in her operational reports. This was after the Germans had been liquidated in the department of the Haute-Loire and Le Puy liberated. A mighty girl, she noted with barely concealed sarcasm. The cavalry had arrived after the battle was won. The FFI seized 19 members of the militia, which had collaborated with the occupiers, and killed 150 Germans and captured 500 in skirmishes. CIA. The statistics represented weeks of combat operations, coordinated from barns and attics, while Hall moved constantly to avoid Gestapo detection teams. Hall and several OSS agents departed the Haute-Loire in late August. Their next assignment took them east to link up with French army units advancing toward the German border. On September 22, 1944, Hall arrived in Paris. The city had been liberated 4 days earlier. American forces had entered from the west, while Free French units secured key government buildings. General Charles de Gaulle had marched down the Champs-Élysées to delirious crowds who had lived under occupation for 4 years. Hull watched the celebrations with the detachment of someone who had spent too long operating in shadows to feel comfortable in sunlight. Paris was liberated. France would soon be free. But the war continued, and OSS had another mission waiting: Austria. The assignment came through official channels in October 1944. German resistance was stiffening as Wehrmacht forces fell back toward the Reich. Allied intelligence needed agents who could infiltrate areas still under Nazi control and foment resistance among populations that might accelerate collapse. Hall volunteered immediately. She and Lieutenant Paul Guyot, an OSS agent she had worked with in France, began preparing for insertion into Austria. The mission planning was complex. Forged documents, cover stories, communication protocols, escape routes if operations were compromised. They were making final preparations when the news arrived. Germany had surrendered. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Virginia Hall's operational career in occupied territory ended not with a dramatic mission, but with a cancelled deployment. She and Guyot returned to Paris. Hall wrote detailed after-action reports. She identified French civilians who had assisted Allied operations and deserved recognition. She compiled lists of collaborators who had betrayed resistance members to the Gestapo. And in September 1945, she received recognition that had been delayed for security reasons. Major General William Donovan, founder and director of the Office of Strategic Services, presented Virginia Hall with the Distinguished Service Cross in a private ceremony. No publicity, no photographers, no public announcement. Hall insisted on secrecy because she intended to continue intelligence work. Fame would make her useless as an operative. The citation documented her accomplishments with bureaucratic precision, entered voluntarily into enemy-occupied France from March to September 1944, established and maintained radio communications with London, organized, armed, and trained 3 battalions of French resistance forces operated in regions infested with enemy troops while continually at risk of capture, torture, and execution. Hall was the only civilian woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross during World War II. The medal ranked second only to the Medal of Honor for Valor in Combat. She accepted the award in General Donovan's office, shook hands, posed for a single photograph that would remain classified for decades, then returned to work. The war had ended, but the intelligence mission continued. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. The Cold War was beginning, and the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency needed experienced operatives who understood how to work in hostile territory. Virginia Hall joined the CIA in 1947. For the next 19 years, she worked in the Special Activities Division. Most of her operations remain classified. What is known suggests she helped establish resistance networks across Europe that could activate if Soviet forces invaded Western countries. She married Paul Guyot in 1950. They had met during operations in France. He understood her work because he had done the same work. They bought a farm in Maryland, raised vegetables, maintained the cover of an ordinary retired couple. Hall retired from the CIA in 1966 at the mandatory retirement age of 60. Her personnel file contained a notation that colleagues felt she had been sidelined in her later years. Male officers who felt threatened by her experience and capabilities had relegated her to analysis work instead of operational assignments. The woman who had organized resistance across occupied France, who had coordinated sabotage operations that disrupted German logistics, who had been declared the most dangerous Allied spy by the Gestapo. That woman spent her final CIA years writing reports that less experienced officers ignored. She lived quietly in retirement, avoided interviews, declined public appearances, maintained the operational security that had kept her alive during the war. Virginia Hall died on July 8, 1982, at her home in Maryland. She was 78 years old. Her obituary in the Washington Post was brief. It mentioned her wartime service, but provided few details. Most of her achievements remained classified. The recognition came later, decades later. The decades after Virginia Hall's retirement passed quietly. She and Paul Guyot lived on their farm in Barnesville, Maryland. They grew vegetables. They maintained gardens. They lived as ordinary retired Americans whose neighbors had no idea what they had done during the war. Hall avoided interviews. She declined speaking engagements. When historians tried to contact her about wartime operations, she politely refused to provide details. Most of her CIA work remained classified. Much of her OSS work was still sensitive, and she had spent too many years learning to keep secrets to start talking freely in retirement. She died on July 8, 1982, at Adventist Hospital in Rockville, Maryland. She was 76 years old. Her obituary in the Washington Post was brief. It mentioned her Distinguished Service Cross. It noted her work with SOE and OSS during the war. It provided few operational details. Most Americans who read that obituary had no idea who Virginia Hall was, what she had accomplished, what she had risked, what she had overcome. The recognition came slowly, incrementally, building over decades as classified documents were released and historians pieced together the full scope of her operations. In 1988, her name was added to the Military Intelligence Corps. Hall of Fame, a mighty girl, a quiet ceremony, an engraved plaque. Attendance by military intelligence officers who understood exactly what Hall's coordination of Maquis forces in 1944 had accomplished. The United States Army Intelligence Center went further. In 1994, they named a dining facility after her at Fort Huachuca, Arizona. Soldiers training to become intelligence specialists would eat their meals in a building honoring the woman who had established the template for modern intelligence operations in hostile territory. In 2006, on the 100th anniversary of her birth, the French and British ambassadors in Washington honored her a mighty girl. The French ceremony was particularly poignant. Virginia Hall had risked execution to help liberate France. She had organized resistance networks that killed or captured hundreds of German soldiers. She had coordinated sabotage operations that disrupted Wehrmacht logistics during the critical months after D-Day, and France had never properly thanked her. The British recognition was equally overdue. King George VI had signed a royal warrant in 1943, making Hall a member of the Order of the British Empire, a mighty girl. Hall had refused the award at the time. Accepting it publicly would have compromised her cover. She planned to continue operating in occupied territory. Fame would make her useless. In 2006, the British ambassador presented the warrant to Hall's niece, Lorna Catling, 63 years after it was signed, decades after Hall could have enjoyed the recognition. But timing mattered less than acknowledgement. Britain was finally saying what should have been said in 1943. Your work saved lives. Your courage mattered. We remember. The Central Intelligence Agency took even longer to properly honor one of their founding operations officers. In 2016, a CIA field agent training facility was named the Virginia Hall Expeditionary Center, a mighty girl. The timing was significant. 71 years after the war ended, 34 years after her death. But finally, the organization she had served for 19 years was acknowledging her contributions at the highest institutional level. The CIA Museum went further. The museum gives 5 operatives, individual sections in its catalog. One is Virginia Hall. The other 4 are men who went on to head the CIA, a mighty girl. The statement was clear. Hall belonged in the same category as Allen Dulles, William Colby, Richard Helms, and William Casey, not because she became director, because her operational accomplishments during World War II established standards that every CIA officer studied. Hall was inducted into the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame in 2019, a mighty girl. The ceremony honored her as a Maryland native who had changed history, from Baltimore to occupied France, from consular clerk to the most wanted Allied spy in Europe, from disabled woman to Distinguished Service Cross recipient. Her story was Marilyn's story. American ambition constrained by institutional prejudice, American courage proving those constraints irrelevant. The books began appearing in the 2000s. Detailed biographies drawing on declassified documents, interviews with surviving resistance members, and operational reports that had remained sealed for decades. Judith Pearson's The Wolves at the Door, the true story of America's greatest female spy, in 2005 provided the first comprehensive account of Hall's operations. The title acknowledged what historians had been documenting. Greatest, not one of, not among, the greatest female spy America produced during World War II. Sonia Purnell's A Woman of No Importance, in 2019, drew its title from the State Department's assessment when Hall applied to become a diplomat. The bureaucrats, who rejected her because of her prosthetic leg, had called her a woman of no importance. 70 years later, the phrase became a monument to institutional blindness. The feature film A Call to Spy premiered at the Edinburgh International Film Festival in 2019, commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Sarah Megan Thomas portrayed Hall. The film won the Audience Choice Award in Canada. It received the Anti-Defamation League's Stand Up Award at the 2020 Santa Barbara International Film Festival. Another film, A Woman of No Importance, starring Daisy Ridley as Hall, was announced in 2017 based on Purnell's book. The Hollywood that had celebrated actresses like Hedy Lamarr while dismissing their intelligence was finally telling stories about women whose minds had won wars. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the CIA itself in the way it chose to honor Hall's memory for officers who would never see her face. In 2021, the CIA Museum unveiled a tactile exhibit designed for blind and low-vision officers, LOC. The exhibit was a three-dimensional recreation of Les Marguerites fleuriront ce soir, a painting by artist Jeffrey Bass showing Hall transmitting radio messages from a barn in occupied France. Officers working with the museum embedded a hidden message in the Morse code soundbites, creating a stir among the CIA code-breaking community LOC. Hall would have appreciated that, the playfulness, the secrecy, the reminder that intelligence work required creativity as much as courage. The exhibit allowed blind and low-vision CIA officers to experience Hall's story through touch and sound, to feel the barn walls, to hear the radio static, to understand the physical reality of operating in hostile territory where every transmission risked death. The choice to make Hall's story accessible to disabled officers carried profound significance. Hall had lost her leg at 27. The State Department told her that amputees could not serve as diplomats. Institutional policy declared her unfit for the work she wanted to do. She proved them catastrophically wrong. She became the most effective Allied spy in occupied France. She organized resistance networks that disrupted German logistics during the most critical phase of the war. She received the Distinguished Service Cross. She joined the CIA and served for 19 years. And 70 years later, the CIA was using her story to inspire disabled officers, to demonstrate that physical limitation and operational excellence were not mutually exclusive, to prove that the only real disability was institutional prejudice that prevented talented people from serving. The lesson of Virginia Hall's life was not that disabled people could overcome their limitations. The lesson was that her prosthetic leg was never a limitation. It was irrelevant to her operational capabilities. What mattered was her intelligence, her language skills, her courage, her ability to read people and situations, her willingness to accept risks that terrified able-bodied officers. The State Department that rejected her, the SOE instructors who worried she was too conspicuous, the Maquis colonels who resented taking orders from a woman, the CIA officials who passed her over for promotions, all of them made the same mistake. They looked at Cuthbert and assumed weakness. The Gestapo made the opposite error. Klaus Barbie and his intelligence officers knew exactly how dangerous Hall was. They knew she had organized the Heckler network in Lyon. They knew she had helped dozens of downed Allied pilots escape to Spain. They knew she was coordinating resistance activities across southern France. What they could not do was catch her. Hall moved too carefully, changed her routine too frequently, disguised herself too completely, and operated with the kind of tradecraft that comes from understanding that a single mistake means torture and execution. When she dyed her hair grey and filed down her teeth to pose as a 60-year-old milkmaid, Hall was applying lessons learned during 4 years as Fritz Mandel's wife. Men consistently underestimated women. The more conventional and unremarkable she appeared, the safer she became. A limping old peasant woman herding cows attracted no attention. A glamorous American journalist would have been arrested within days. The final irony of Virginia Hall's story is how completely she succeeded at remaining unknown during her lifetime. She wanted obscurity. She refused public ceremonies. She declined to be photographed. Receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, she kept her CIA work classified. She lived her final 16 years on a Maryland farm without fanfare or recognition. She got exactly what she wanted, and in doing so, she nearly disappeared from history. Only the slow release of classified documents, decades after her death, revealed the full scope of what she had accomplished. The resistance networks, the intelligence reports, the sabotage coordination, the training operations, the risks she accepted, the lives she saved. In 2025, as this script is being written, Virginia Hall has finally received the recognition she deserved in 1945. Buildings bear her name. Museums display her artifacts. Films tell her story. Books document her operations. Intelligence officers study her methods. But the most important recognition comes from understanding what her story reveals about institutional prejudice and human potential. The State Department that rejected her because of her prosthetic leg was wrong. The assumption that physical disability meant operational incapacity was wrong. The belief that women could not lead in combat situations was wrong. The bureaucrats who sidelined her during her CIA career were wrong. Virginia Hall proved all of them wrong, not by overcoming her disability, but by demonstrating that her disability was never relevant to her capabilities. What mattered was her mind, her courage, her skills, her determination, and her absolute refusal to accept institutional limitations that had no basis in operational reality. The lesson extends far beyond intelligence work or military service. In every field, in every institution, talented people face barriers erected by prejudice disguised as policy, physical disability, gender, race, age, class, any characteristic that allows mediocre gatekeepers to exclude exceptional candidates. Virginia Hall's response to those barriers provides the template. Apply anyway. Prove them wrong through performance. Build the skills they claim you lack. Accept risks they consider impossible. And document results so thoroughly that future generations cannot deny what you accomplished. The trains that derailed because Hall coordinated Maquis operations, the bridges that collapsed because she distributed plastic explosives, the German soldiers who died or surrendered because she organized armed resistance, the intelligence reports she transmitted that allowed Allied planners to adjust their strategies, the supply drops she coordinated that armed thousands of resistance fighters. None of that required 2 functional legs. It required intelligence, courage, language skills, operational security, and the kind of determination that comes from being told repeatedly that you're not qualified for work. You know you can do better than the people rejecting you. Hall died in 1982, believing her work would remain classified and forgotten. She could not have known that 21st century CIA officers would study her methods as the foundation of modern covert operations. She could not have imagined that training facilities would bear her name, that museums would create exhibits about her life, that films would tell her story to audiences who had never heard of the limping lady. But perhaps she would have appreciated the most fitting tribute, the blind and low-vision CIA officers who experience her story through the tactile exhibit, who learn that one of their organization's greatest operatives succeeded despite institutional barriers that should never have existed, who understand that physical limitation and operational excellence are not contradictory, who see in Virginia Hall's story proof that the only real disability is the prejudice that prevents talented people from serving. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.